Hi, Weslaco ISD. Claudia Martinez here. I want to talk to you today about checks for understanding and talk about the why, when, who, what, and how. And I want to show you one virtual resource that you can use. All right, so checks for understanding are essentially mini formative assessments that should inform both the teacher as well as the student. And really, the whole purpose for why we do checks for understanding is to make mid-course corrections. There's no reasons to do checks for understanding if we do nothing with that information. And then, of course, once we find out that information, we make the decision if we want to course correct with the whole group, with a small group, or with a targeted group of students. So why do we do checks for understanding? So I like to use the autopsy versus physical example. And so if we do not do checks for understanding, it's like the first time we go in to see a doctor is when we go in for an autopsy, right? Everything is over. There's nothing that we can do. Instead, what we want to do is use checks for understanding as a physical. So we want to test students or assess their knowledge to see if they're getting it or not, and then make course corrections. So if I go in and I see that I have high blood pressure, I need to change, my diet, medications I take, my physical activity, so that way my end result is different than if I had not done that. And of course, again, the main reason here is to course correct. So if we find out we have high blood pressure but do nothing about it, there is really no point to go into the doctor then. When should we do checks for understanding? The answer to that would be if you have time, you can do checks for understanding on students' prior knowledge to see where they're at. Definitely after each key point is introduced, ideally you'll ask 1 or 2 questions after each key point to see if students are with you before you move on, so you can chunk that information. During student practice, you check students' understanding. We don't want to simply in the classroom give an assignment, let students work and sit back. Instead, we're checking for understanding by circulating, by seeing how they're doing, giving feedback and adjusting. And then of course to start or end. I'm a favorite of exit tickets. I know some people favorite entrance tickets, but you can use them either at the start or end as a mini formative assessment as well. Who do we want to check for understanding? So textbook answer is a representative sample. So a lot of times we'll say call in a high, a middle, or a low student. Instead, I like to ask how many students should be engaged. And really the answer to that should be 100%. If I'm not checking for understanding of all students may not even know that they don't get it until they're asked to try a problem. And so when I check for understanding, I want to do it in a way in which all my students have to engage, whether it's that they're doing a turn and talk, a whiteboard, a Google form, something where every single person is asked to engage with the material. And I see if they understand it, they see if they understand it as a result of that. What should we check for understanding? And I want to talk about what we should assess and then what tools we can use. In terms of what should be assessed, we always want to go back to our backwards planning, and it should be aligned to our content as well as the rigor. We want to scaffold our questions. So we start with our easier questions first, so that way we can see where student breakdown might occur. If they might understand a portion of it, I don't need to reteach that portion. But when they get to a certain step, I may see, okay, that's where the issue is at. As well as the constraints of the assessment should be considered. So for instance, in math and science, a lot of times there's a reference sheet. I don't want to ask a student a question and provide them with a formula or provide them with the number of protons or the atomic number. Instead, I want to make sure that my students have to go to that reference sheet. They get used to using it just as they would in the real assessment to use that resource, for instance. The next part of the what is what tools we can use. And so whatever tool you decide on, there are a lot of tools out there. It should be consistently and reliably used to provide data. When I was in the classroom, I've listed my favorites on the screen. So after I introduced each key point, I love to use whiteboards. I like that because 100% of students had to be engaged. It was really easy to erase, and I could change my questioning as needed. So if I saw a lot of students aren't getting this, then I could explain and ask a few more questions similar. If I see a lot of students were getting it, I didn't need to ask the next few questions I had planned. I could just move on. So it was really adaptable. During student practice, I used something called aggressive monitoring. So I would have students work on problems that were backward planned or aligned in content and rigor from the TEAC and from assessment items. And I would go through with a pen, and students knew I would check mark meaning they were correct, move on, or I would circle and say, go back and do it again. I would start with my fastest working students first. And that did a couple of things. One, it gave students immediate feedback. A lot of times students thought this part of class was like a game, even though it was a lot of work, because it was really exciting for them to see that they were getting it and they could move on. It also allowed them to explain to one another. So notice when somebody got it wrong, I didn't bend over and start showing it to them, because what that does is it turns my back to the rest of the class and they do not receive feedback. Instead, I said, hey, you got that one wrong. Try it again. I'll come back to check. If I come back and they're still got it wrong, what I would do is I would partner them with somebody else who got it correct to explain it to them. If the first time I explained it to them, they didn't understand, continuing having me explain it the same way is probably not going to get through. A lot of times when another student explains, it turns on a light bulb for them because they'll explain it in a slightly different way. It also, again, allows me to move quickly student to student, so every student receives feedback as they're working throughout. Finally, for exit tickets, even when we were in the classroom and not virtual, I love to use Google Forms. I preferred this method because students received immediate feedback, and that way I could treat my exit ticket not summatively, but formatively. So as soon as students were finished, I would say, okay, you already know what you got wrong. Start working on test corrections. Anything you did not get correct today, do a test correction, explain to me why the correct answer is correct, and you can gain those points back. The whole purpose of that is because we don't want for that to be an end-all be-all. An exit ticket should be an opportunity for learning. Ideally, I want all of my students leaving class understanding all of the concepts for the day. And so instead of treating an exit ticket summatively, I treat it formatively that way to increase mastery. Aware now offers, if you've seen my other videos, Aware now offers the feature for students to get immediate feedback as well. I like Aware now, even though it wasn't available when I was in the classroom, because Aware has that test bank for our grade levels, usually 3 and up. And so if they already have questions in there, it takes you less time to transfer those questions over to Google Forms. And so that's another way if you become familiar with Aware. So I want to take a break here, and I want to go to show you one resource that we can use now that we're virtual for whiteboards. This is the area that most teachers have asked about. In another video, I shared with you how to use Nearpod. Nearpod would be something you could use for the entire lesson, but if you wanted just whiteboards, you kind of like the way that you present already, you don't want to switch to a whole new format or platform, then you can use these whiteboards. So there's a feature called WhiteBoard.Fi, and I'm going to go ahead and just play this video to show you what it can do. All right, so WhiteBoard.Fi gives us the option, just like what we had in the classroom, of using actual whiteboards where we can plan our questions ahead, but we don't have to do much to set it up in the forefront. In fact, a lot of questions that are asked is, can I pre-make my whiteboards with the questions? And actually the answer is no, because it erases after about an hour or so. But what you can do is plan those questions and then verbally or type them in as you assign them out. In addition to the writing that you saw there, which is great for science and math, where we have a lot of equations, you can also use the text feature as well. Our last question is how we would do checks for understanding. So the first and foremost I mentioned is to prepare aligned questions in advance. Ideally, you would prepare these for each key point, for your student practice, as well as for your exit ticket. And then finally, you'd want to notice and decide. So once you do use your formative assessments, you want to notice, are my students getting it or not? What percent are getting it? If I have 80% or more, do I really need to do a whole group reteach? If I have 50% or less, usually I would want to use one of the first two that I mentioned here. If I have a really low understanding, I would usually want to completely reteach and model how to answer that question, and then give them a few more at-bats with it. If I have a low percent, but maybe a little bit higher than what I mentioned before, I could use guided discourse where I display a wrong answer. I say, somebody answered with this. Why might that not be correct? And have them discuss, those misconceptions. If I have a high number, so let's say I have about 80% or more, I might decide to move on, and I may decide just to pull a small group or just to follow up with a select number of students while the rest move on to student practice. So that covers the who, what, when, where, why of checks for understanding. If you have any questions, my name is Claudia Martinez. I'm the K-12 science strategist, and I have my email listed there. Thank y'all and have a great day.